As I'm starting to learn the basics of Blender, one of the problems I'm coming up against is when to use certain tools and when to use others. So I'm going to take a look at smoothing and when we want to use different techniques. Let's get rid of our default cube. Right click. Delete. Now let's add a slightly more complicated default object up in the top. Add. Monkey, aka Suzanne. On the numpad, I'm pressing 1 to view it straight on. Now let's make a couple copies that we can play with. Go up to Object, Duplicate Objects. Now use the middle mouse scroll to zoom in. Hold Shift middle mouse click in order to pan. We can see that just by default, it's a very rough shape. Let's grab this one. Now I'm in object mode. Right click. Shade smooth. We can see it's already looking better. Let's duplicate that one. Shift D. Shift middle click to pan. Now before we go into sculpt mode, I want to make sure one of the settings is correct. Up at the top, Edit. Lock object modes. Let's take that off. And now as I put each one of them into sculpt mode, I can Alt left click to select the next one. Sculpt mode. Alt left click. And now I'll use the shortcut this time, holding down Control Tab on the keyboard. Sculpt mode. So I've got my symmetry there. Alt left click. Got this one. Alt left click. And got this one. Now let's block out a slightly bigger shape for the head of Suzanne. We'll use elastic deform. Alt left click. So we're just exaggerating the shape of the head. And you can see we only have these different vertices to select. So that doesn't give us very many options. Alt left click. Even on this smooth model, still only a couple points. Now let's turn on an overlay, wireframe. And we can see what's going on now. Our sculpting brush is only dragging the pre-existing geometry that's there. It's not creating anything new. So we can use this to rough a shape out or block a shape, but we're not going to be able to add detail this way. So now we want to enable our brush to add detail instead of just stretching it. And we have this option up in the top right, Dyne Topo, which is dynamic topology. Topology is our geometry for our shape, the mesh of it. And we'll just ignore this warning for now. Alt left click. Let's try to add some more detail. First with it off. Alt left click. And let's switch to a more extreme brush, the snake hook. So we can see that really brings it out, but it's still restricted by the topology that's already there, those edges and vertices. Alt left click on our other model. Turn dynamic topology on. There we go. So far we've seen that we can turn the smooth shading on in order to have our model be less blocky, but it won't affect the topology, which in this case is not great when we're just starting out because we really need the extra geometry in order to build out details and other features. If we turn the wireframe overlay off, we can see that they're all still pretty blocky. Let's make sure that smooth shading is still on for these two. And go back to object mode. Shade smooth. And so at this point, I realize that when I use dynamic topology, it takes away the shade smooth feature that we had. Alt left click. One way we can get that back, the settings under Dyne Topo, smooth shading. One thing that helped me when I was making really rough shapes and blocking out my last design is to use Remesh to smooth the shape out after I've got its rough area. So if we try to do that with Remesh, we see that we can't use Remesh and Dyne Topo at the same time. So if we just take that off, we still have that dynamic topology that we added. And now we can actually use Remesh. Wow. We'll have to play with our voxel size, the resolution of the Remesh. Let's take it lower. That might be worse. Let's take it higher. That's definitely worse. On the keyboard, I'm holding Control Z to back up, which is the same as Edit, Undo. So after we've added these exaggerated features, I still want to smooth out the overall model more than just the smooth shading is providing. But when I use remesh, it completely destroys the detail of the face. I'm thinking that remesh is really going to serve us well when we're building general rough shapes. So if I was working on just the ears or just the eyes, I could remesh them after doing dynamic topology on one of my brushes, and it could smooth that part out. Because we started off with the Suzanne model, who has a little detail already, in order to smooth out the overall shape without losing the detail of the face, we're going to reach for one of our modifiers. So we got the Modifier Properties tab, Add Modifier, Subdivision Surface, and I don't know what all of these settings do just yet, but I know that the level of subdivisions we want to do for our viewport, the area we see right here, as we bring this up, it starts to smooth things out. So if I make this really high, you can see that my computer's starting to lag. Let's bring this down to 4. And we'll apply. Now let's take a look at the meshes. And this is just insane. So now if we were to use the same tool, we've got a lot of geometry to play with. And then let's say we wanted another high quality version of this, because having this much geometry makes it really easy to sculpt. Go to Object Mode, Shift D to duplicate. Let's do that again. And put those into sculpt mode. Alt left clicking to select another one. I still got all of that nice detail. Let's keep smoothing this out. Subdivision again. That took a second. Now let's smooth. That's taking longer than a second. Go up to 3. Uh-oh. So while I just had one model, it was pretty fluid. But now that I've got 3 models and I keep adding detail, I'm going to crash Blender. We could see that for a second there, it wasn't responding. Let me clear out that one. We'll take this one out as well. So while just relying on the Subdivision Surface modifier seemed like a good idea, once we had a couple high detailed models, my computer just got completely bogged down. So it's seeming like the process is going to be that we create our model in a really rough looking starting out point where we want to block out the basic shape of it, build our largest shapes and features, and then if we want to see how it would look when it's smooth, we can go into object mode and right-click on our object and have it shade smooth, which we see in the face of this middle example of Suzanne. But at the top, we see that shading smooth didn't add any more topology. So when we went to draw in details, it was limited to the faces and the vertices that the model still had, which was better reflected over here on the left. So in order to build up this feature, we had to switch our brushes to dynamic topology, build up the shape that we wanted, and then at the end, apply a subdivision surface modifier. Along the way, we're also going to use our Remesh tool, and we use this when we're starting out on really rough shapes that we need to even out the topology of, but we're not ready to reach for something quite as detailed and as computer heavy as the subdivision surface modifier, which if we use too much is going to slow us down. But there's another trick with that. Let's select this one, Alt left click, Shift D to duplicate. So again, this one was smooth shaded, but we didn't have enough topology to really draw out these horns. Let's switch to sculpt mode. This time I'm going to use the shortcut Control Tab. And we're on our snake hook brush. Still limited by that topology. So let's turn on dynamic topology. Now we've got fluid sculpting again, really smooth. And now that I've built up the topology in just that area, I want to smooth out the model again. But I know that the subdivision surface modifier was really slowing down when we applied it. So it's still pretty fluid now at 3, and that's because we restarted with this low topology model and we haven't applied the subdivision surface multiplier yet, which you can tell in the eyes. So I want a mixture of the face in this one, in the dynamic topology of the horns in this one. So let's start again. New general project. Right click to delete. And then we're going to add mesh Suzanne. 1 on the numpad to view it straight on. Mouse scroll wheel to zoom in. We'll right click, shade smooth. Now before we get too far, add a modifier, Subdivision Surface. Now we've got that great detail in the eyes that we lost before. And we've only got one level of subdivision, so hopefully that won't be too intense. And instead of applying it, let's go into sculpt mode. For the horns, I'm going to use the snake hook. Let's adjust our brush size a little bit smaller. F on the keyboard for brush size. Shift F on the keyboard for brush strength. Let's see what that's like. Oh, and we know that we come over here and turn on our dynamic topology. That way we're creating more geometry, not just stretching what we already have. And so the first thing that throws us off, our smooth shading got turned off. We'll turn that right back on here. And actually, let's increase the brush, F on the keyboard. Really bring that out. And now we want to smooth the overall shape. And again, because we have too much detail, we've already ruled out remeshing it. Otherwise, we'd lose the face. So let's see. So that's not making a difference. But if we take off dynamic topology, which is kind of like applying it, now we can really smooth that area out. Notice that we still haven't applied subdivision modifier, but we see its effect. So I wonder, remember to unlock those and bring it back into sculpt mode. Alt left click to select. Control tab. And so it's slowed down a little bit, but these are three very smooth models that have a subdivision level of 4. Just having 2 of these previously crashed my computer. So what we're able to do is use subdivision surface modifiers to preview how smooth the model could look if we applied it. But we can continue doing our sculpting without adding in all of that geometry. If we look at our wireframe, so it's not that more complicated than just the basic Suzanne. And for example, let me apply one of these. And you can see just how dense that mesh gets. And sure, it's super smooth to drag the mesh out now, but we already saw if I have even 2 of these models, Blender's crashing. Whereas here, it's a little bit slower in response, but at least I'm not worried about the computer crashing. And if I want to, I can always go back and apply this once I get closer to being done with my model. Now that I'm starting to understand the basics of how to rough out the shape of my model and block it out, and then how to smooth it in multiple different ways as I go, I'm getting the hang of how to get into a workflow that's going to keep Blender from crashing and also still make my model sculptable. And once I have the hang of these basics, I'll be ready to move on to harder things like painting the model and perhaps even animating it. I hope you'll stick around for that.